So onward we go through our conversation, looking now at innovation in the city, the Innovation Metropolis, how universities, companies, and research networks are reshaping the economy. Have a great panel coming up, and I hope maybe the panel will give an opportunity for our attendees to ask some questions as you go through the process. But let's meet our panelist. Please welcome first the president of the International City Managers Association from Edmonton, Canada, Simon Farbrother. From Mexico City, the director of the Laboratory of the City from Mexico City, Gabriela Gomez Montt. Gabriela, welcome. And from Montreal, the president and CEO of the Trudeau Foundation, Pierre Guerrier Faure. Pierre. And finally, originally from New York City, where he had been the head of the New York Economic Development Corporation, but now has been transplanted to Toronto as the president of the Mars Discovery District, one of the continent's most impressive innovation hubs, Ewan Robinson. And our panel chair from Cornell University, the dean of the Johnson Business School, Sumitra Dutta. Welcome, and thank you all. We look forward to your conversation.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this panel. The topic for today's panel is titled the Innovation Metropolis, and we have some 4 excellent panel members to help discuss this theme. This theme has already appeared in some of the initial presentations made in the first part of the conference, and I'd like to perhaps begin by requesting each of our panel members to just briefly introduce themselves and just give a quick hint in terms of the angle they bring to this debate. And we will certainly go further in details and further questions. Maybe you can begin with you, Simon.
Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Simon Farbrother. I've been a city manager in a number of cities across Canada, more recently in Waterloo, Ontario, and currently in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And I've also been had the pleasure to sit on the International City County Management Association and the incoming president. In terms of this discussion, as we heard this morning, place shaping and place making are sort of fundamental to long-term success, and the various aspects of academia play very, very solidly into that discussion.
Hello, good morning. My name is Gabriela Gomez Montt. I am heading a project in Mexico City called Laboratorio para la Ciudad, Laboratory for the City. And this is a new project that depends directly on the mayor's office, and what we're in charge of is civic innovation and urban creativity. So in many ways it becomes the first experimental arm, the first creative office of the city of Mexico City.
So good morning, my name is P.G. Forrest. I'm the president of the Trudeau Foundation. We are a research foundation. We support not so much research, but people who are doing research, mostly in universities, in 4 areas: environment, citizenship, human rights, and international relations. And I've been with the foundation for the last close to 7 years, but prior to that I was Assistant Deputy Secretary for Science and Research with the Federal Department of Health in Canada.
Good morning, everyone. Ewan Robertson. Spent about 10 or 12 years in London in the private sector before I moved to New York City, and then spent the last 5 years or so working for New York City EDC, working actually with some of the people you saw, for those of you who were in Bruce Katz's presentation, Deputy Mayor Bob Steele and Seth Pinsky on the applied sciences effort, amongst other things, and very recently, about a month ago, relocated to Toronto to be president and CEO of something called the Mars Discovery District. Very interested in the confluence between science and technology research, whether that's happening in academia or in industry, and innovation, job creation, and development of economies at a municipal, national, and international level.
Now, at Cornell, we are very involved with this applied sciences initiative at Roosevelt Island in New York City. And one of the goals I'd like to achieve in this panel is to sort of take a deep dive into selective projects and try to get some experiences across the world in some sense. So let's begin with the Applied Sciences Initiative. We've heard it being mentioned already in some of the presentations. Why was it started? What's the key motivation?
I think you heard a little bit about this in the previous presentation, but I can dive a little deeper. So when the mayor first took office back in 2001, Mayor Bloomberg, he was very conscious of the need to diversify New York City's economy, given the reliance of the economy on financial services. And financial services will always be an important hub within New York, but really kind of from a risk management point of view, it was always going to be important to diversify and grow other sectors of the economy. If you then fast forward to the financial crisis that hit in 2008, that really kind of forced the administration to double down on those efforts to think about economic diversification. And we at EDC were charged with coming up with a long-term plan to create an engine really to kind of accelerate that economic diversification. When we started looking at the sectors of the economy that were either already strong in New York, which we needed to maintain and sustain, and also those sectors which had high growth potential, we realized that there was this big intersection, right, between those industry sectors and the availability of science, technology, and engineering talent, and that while we had a number of excellent universities in the city already, NYU being one, Columbia being another, we didn't have an institution that was kind of the caliber or which had the focus on links with industry, links between academic research and science and technology, like the kind of Stanfords, the MITs, those kind of institutions. So that was kind of some of the background. And then we looked at what we as city government and an economic development entity could do to try and work with universities to find out whether they would be interested in growing their presence here or investing. And that's really what led to the Applied Sciences project, or the Applied Sciences competition, which was launched as a global competition.
But let me ask you the question, Ewan. How important is it to have a leader with a vision? The question really is, would the initiative happen without Mayor Bloomberg's vision, or can cities come up with this kind of a grand initiative in a more of a bottom-up fashion?
I think leadership is certainly tremendously important, and clearly having a mayor like Mayor Bloomberg who was willing to undertake what could have been, a very high risk, certainly was a very high profile effort, willing to put significant city resources on the line behind that effort, and most importantly willing to take a leadership position against something that would really only reach maturity and full payback in terms of the expected benefits to the city over a prolonged time period was tremendously important. But it's not only the municipal leader. I mean, clearly there was tremendous leadership involved on behalf of all the institutions and the presidents and senior leaders and board members of those universities which participated and applied to the process. There was also leadership shown by various representatives of the private sector. So this is really a kind of a coming together of academia, of the private sector, of civic leadership, and of municipal government. And I think you need leadership across all of those sectors, and it needs to be a partnership across all of those.
Let's just probe this area of leadership for a second. I'd like to involve other panel colleagues on that, because from inside Cornell, I could see very clearly how the leadership of the president, the provost, and the senior management was so critical to mobilize the entire alumni community, the entire faculty body, because as you can expect, in any university, faculty always have many different views, and
Sure.
there's some faculty who are happy about it, some who are not so happy about it. And to mobilize everyone required were leadership. What experiences do you have from your own context in Mexico and Canada about the importance of leadership at different levels, and how do you pull these elements together?
Well, I think that this creation of vision, sometimes from the top down and many times from the bottom up, is extremely important. Mexico City, as you know, is a mega city, one of the biggest cities in the world. And I have the feeling that in the last year, since we've only had a mayor since '97, and it's always been a left-wing government. And what has happened in Mexico City context has been very interesting, because it has become, in Latin America, one of the safe havens for a very progressive social city. So we passed gay rights before New York did. We have abortion laws in place. We have a limited form of euthanasia. When you think about this happening in the context of an extremely religious country, and when you think about this happening actually spurred on not only because of grassroots movements, but because of leaders actually painting a different picture of what a city in Latin America could be like, I think it becomes of extreme importance how we are envisioning the futures of our cities and how these leaders can actually paint these scenarios for us. One very tiny example that you're going through in New York right now is even with these gestures that seem to be tiny, but on a symbolic level can be huge. 3 years back, we started our journey to having bike sharing system in place in Mexico City. And mostly everybody, both from within government and from without government, used to think that it was impossible because this is a mega city and it's a death wish, as many people said. And nowadays we have 18,000 bike shares a day, and more importantly than the bikes themselves and this expansion of other types of transport, it's the idea of a city, of what a megalopolis is capable or incapable of doing. So I actually think that sometimes when we can defy through strong leadership and then through like these movements that traverse society, the notions that we have of ourselves and what we're capable as a community, as a city, that becomes of transcendent importance. And then that symbolic space that it opens up actually creates an area for reality to seep in. So I think that that is actually one of the most important factors in important transformations in cities.
From either PJ or from Simon, any experience in Canada that you'd like to share with a focus on the leadership element?
Well, I think it's really a conversation around permissions and actually setting tone. You know, in the absence of leadership, you know, any path will sort of get you there. And I think having people that can coalesce around an idea and take that idea and start to drive with it and share with others starts to create a sort of a sense of purpose. But the second piece there is the permission. And it's that ability to invite others into that conversation that lead to sort of the creation of opportunities. And you know, I've experienced over, you know, many years where, you know, positions of authority have been unable to move the ball in any way, shape or form because of their inability to set a sense of purpose and create the permissions to allow that to happen. And earlier in this morning, the discussion around the role of the federal government, state government, and city government, it is absolutely going to be the age of the cities, but they're going to have to figure a way out to have those conversations with other levels of government, because those other levels of government still hold the permissions. And so it's a bit of a combo.
PG, can I just maybe ask you to expand on it, but maybe take one example. So can you take one example and sort of walk us through it and sort of identify what were the key success factors in that specific area?
I have a very negative example that I could mention. You know, the mayor of the city in which I live has been arrested yesterday under 14 charges of corruption. So I know what the lack of leadership looks like. No, but more seriously, I have seen leadership as well in other type of institutions that are very important, and like universities, for instance. It's very clear that any interesting example I could think of in terms of initiative and innovation, you could point to a particular leader in the university, and it's very telling that the most innovative universities in Canada at this moment have been led by remarkable individuals. And so yes, I truly believe it is essential and important.
So besides leadership, which we identify as something important both at the top and diffused across the different network of players, what other elements have to be in place to create this innovation metropolis? So other key elements that you'd identify? Of course, you know, there are so many different elements have to come together, but what are the top 3, 4, 5 examples of key critical success factors?
I think something that, again, that Bruce Katz said earlier, which struck a chord, and certainly in the context of what we were trying to do with applied sciences, was figure out what your key assets are, figure out what you're good at, and then try and leverage those, and don't try and take a blueprint that was developed in another city or another metropolis and just copy it wholesale. So, for example, speaking specifically to New York, you know, even though the city government's contribution to the project was significant in terms of the funding towards infrastructure and the land on Roosevelt Island, or indeed some of the other projects that came out of the applied sciences process, that wouldn't have been sufficient to leverage the level of investment being made if that was all there was on the table, right? So what's on the table is actually the unique assets that New York brings to those universities that are participating in the process in terms of their long-term strategic objectives, whether that's the type of faculty that they can attract, the type of students they can attract, the links that they can build to the industry clusters that are here in New York, so on and so forth. And you have to kind of take a fairly rigorous and robust inventory of those assets and then figure out, okay, how are we going to leverage those to attract the type of investment we want to see?
Other perspectives on critical success factors, other key elements?
Well, one of the key elements that we're going to be playing with from within the laboratory is much has been spoken about density and the interesting fact that cities, since they concentrate so much mind talent, become a very good place for incubating ideas and just like for this explosive amount of talent, if you will. One of the things that we've noticed in Mexico City particularly is that besides density, what you need is a surface that is very much interconnected and where ideas can travel and propagate very quickly. So what needs to happen for the city space to become that place of propagation of ideas? Is it policy that's blocking it? Is it because some networks are not connected? Is it because, for example, disciplines or universities are working in isolation? Is it because we do not have a proper narrative for the things that are already happening in the city and we actually need to bring that to surface so this can become a self-propelling prophecy? So it's all these open-ended questions of what is needed for the city space to become the space of innovation and not necessarily housed within different structures, but these structures that start becoming interconnected that will become very much the substance of our conversation with the city and with the government and with civil society.
Yeah, I would like to go back to your point about universities. And you know, the universities, the modern universities, as you all know, have emerged in the 19th century with three major roles: creation of knowledge. We borrowed that from the German university. The idea that we should transfer knowledge to decision makers, and that was the French model. And the idea that we should open the mind of the children of the elite so that they could go and look beyond the prejudices of their class. And that was England. So creation of knowledge, dissemination of knowledge, and celebration of knowledge. Those were the three major roles of the universities. But this monopoly doesn't exist anymore. It's very clear that this is taking place in all other sectors of society. And so the university has to reinvent itself, and it could only reinvent itself if it accepts to be exemplary. You cannot say that you're the best institution in the world to learn about the environment and not having an environmental practice yourself, or that you're teaching business ethics and not being yourself as a university managed ethically. You need, as you mentioned, to accept complexity, and this requires a reflection on disciplines and borders and silos within the university itself, because I think this is one of the last very important strengths of universities to cope with the problem of our communities. And finally, I think, and this is why I'm a big fan of the Mars project, is that there is this need to connect and commit to the problems with the community to help them solve their problems. And this could happen. This is an example, for instance. You like example, I bring an example. So this is a book on gun violence. It has been produced by colleagues of mine at Hopkins. And they produced this book in 10 days after Newton, because they thought it was important to bring the evidence, the best evidence available in the world, to decision makers. And I think we should be able to do more of that. I'm also an academic, and I publish in books. You know, that takes 3 years to produce. And then people lament about the fact that decision makers ignore evidence. I think we could do more of that.
Simon, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, when we think about sort of cities today and you know, the context in which they actually exist, it is so multidimensional and it is so uncontrolled. We think that, you know, municipal governments put layers on, they look after infrastructure, you know, police, security, those kind of stuff. But the real action is just happening every day, every minute. And so we've moved from an environment where, you know, you lay out the ground rules and hope something will happen, to very much an environment in which innovation and creativity are taking place, and then you try to leverage that opportunity. So whether it's startup or whether, you know, I'll just use Edmonton as an example. So we have startup, we have Tech Edmonton, we have the university that is making us, you know, wants to be one of the top universities in the world. And I think that's a really important statement, because every community should want to be the top in whatever it is. So we talk about building a great city. And it's not about building departments, it's not about building roads, it's about building a great city. And the only way you have a great city is if you have people, and the only way you have people if you have things of quality of life that they choose to locate for. And education is a fundamental to that. And so as an entity, as a city, our role is to increase the educational capability of everybody that chooses to live in the city. And the only way to do that is by bringing things together. Simple things like connecting our 4 academic institutions on the rapid rail system. Suddenly you have shared library opportunities. Simple opportunities like creating public space so that people can connect between those 4 academic institutions. Simple opportunities around creating the ability for the universities to co-locate within their own environment, but also within the city. And so you don't create these sort of niches. You know, the old days was almost like a university was like the big box. It's great, but in reality, people only go to the big box once a week, where you actually want people to experience university life 24/7. And as cities, our challenge is to respond to, we're in the A to Z business and we're in the 24/7 business. So how we structure, how we organize ourselves has to reflect that. And that's a model of being really a responder as opposed to a command controller. And it has driven a whole bunch of initiatives, but essentially those initiatives are being driven from groups of interest, clusters of interest, and then leveraging them up. And you know, the comments earlier today about doing it in your own environment really hold true today.
You know, I am reminded about the experiences that we went inside Cornell as we are looking at the implementation in Cornell Tech at Roosevelt Island. And even small symbolic changes are so important. I'll give you one example. In the new Cornell Tech campus, we have decided that professors will not have closed offices. Okay, we'll have open plan offices like you find in many companies today. The small detail. But culturally, for faculty members not to have the security of those 4 walls is like a tremendous change. So what we are seeing, and this is very interesting, is we are seeing that initiatives such as this Applied Sciences Cornell Tech initiative can act as a trigger for change inside our own organization. Because otherwise, if there's no trigger for change, sometimes the change is much more difficult to sort of make happen. I want to bring your perspectives into the discussion because, you know, we can keep on carrying on with the dialogue on the panel. So let me just invite a few questions. So let's just take a few questions and we'll feed the questions into the next part of the panel discussion. So please come up to the microphones if you have a comment or a question. My one request is please briefly introduce yourself and keep the question or the comment short.
I'll try my best, thank you. Andrew Simmons. I wanted to ask actually about a little bit about the connection, say, between urban design and local economic development. And so it occurs to me actually that it's sort of a challenge, let's say, for the Cornell Tech campus because it's actually on an island. And so what I'm saying sort of in more theoretical or conceptual terms is how do you foster local economic development given the constraint of its being on an island in what could happen of having SMEs feeding off of the concentrated activity. And of course we know the reason why it is where it is because that's where the city had the land to provide to Cornell. But I'm wondering, so maybe to speak about Cornell specifically or the examples in other cities of how urban design and spatial considerations can be used to foster local economic development given how this occurs, let's say in economic geography theory, from close proximity and in some cases immediate proximity. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. Any other question? We'll take a few questions if you have some. Please just come to the microphone and just
Yeah, just a quick question for the Canadians. I myself am a Canadian from Edmonton. We've heard from the US this morning. We've also just heard from Mexico. Under our Harper government, which is in essence Thatcher reincarnated, it really is up to the cities to produce this kind of innovation or ecological environments. Can you give me one example from any of these cities, Toronto, Montreal, or Edmonton? We haven't heard any today.
Any other? Yes, please, ma'am.
Carol Lavisle, Dean of the School of Professional Extended Studies at American University. To the role of universities, yes, that role has changed significantly, but we are being asked to do more things for more people and adapt at a faster pace with fewer and fewer resources. And so we are very much in the same boat as the metropolitans. And I'm wondering if the panel has any suggestions for how universities can not just foster innovation in the cities, as many of your projects are describing, but also how the cities can connect more effectively with universities so that it really does become a two-way street. Thank you.
My question, I don't know if the panelists can answer it, but I'm sure you hear about it, so I'd be interested in your perspective. And Jill Lerner from KPF and AIA, but my question is Singapore. So Singapore has tried to recast itself as Education City for Asia. And I was wondering, they've paired up with lots of American universities, prominent universities actually from different places. And I was wondering how successful you think they will be at using that as a vehicle to keep their city innovative and so forth.
Good, let's take these 4 questions, and Simon, do you want to begin?
So it's always interesting to try and answer 4 questions in once, but there's a couple of pieces here. Singapore's a really interesting place, and we actually talk about Singapore a fair bit as we think about other cities around the world. And the one thing that Singapore's been able to do is really influence its physical design. But how successful in the long run has it been around sort of its cultural integration? And cities in the long run will be around people, not physical infrastructure. And so to the question, around the Canadian government, Stephen Harper is our current Prime Minister. Again, it comes back to cities really do have an influence on the, urban form. And there's lots of opportunities in that regard. Everybody is focusing around densification, and absolutely they should be. But we have to do it within a North American sort of context. You can't just take a city and overlay it on whatever city you happen to be. So how do you leverage the assets that you've got, increase densification? But at the end of the day, it's a quality of life discussion. And so as just a simple example, there's a project at the moment which is looking to put 3 schools of the University of Alberta in the downtown core. But the reason the schools are going there is to support 2 performing arts centres. And the reason the performing arts centres are going there because the office tower complex is going to charge lease rates that will pay the operating costs of the performing arts centres. And the reason the city is interested because when you hook these 3 things together, you create a galleria of open space, public connection, which is connected to a new Alberta museum. And all these elements are within 200-300 yards of City Hall. And what you've suddenly now got is you've got private sector investment, you've got academia, you've got the public sector investment, and you've got an improvement in public space in the core. And all cities actually need a core. It's really important to have villages within a city, points of access, points of concentration, but places have reputations, and their reputations are often driven by the success of their cores.
I'll address the question on universities. Laboratorio para la Ciudad was started 2 months ago, and so it was announced by our mayor 2 months ago. And one of the type of people that have been writing the most are actually university professors that deal in any type of, just like chemistry professors, urban prototyping professors, truly like cross-disciplinary in their skill sets and the classes that they give. And so one of the things that we're very interested in doing from within the laboratorio is how do we start creating spaces within the city for these universities, instead of becoming isolated in their academic ivory towers, if you will. How can they actually use the city to put many of these ideas to a test? How can we create networks among them as well so they can start sharing information? And how do we kickstart certain conversations? Because, for example, Mexico is now graduating more engineers than the US is. Now, the question would be, do they have the right skill set for the way that the world is changing, would be an open-ended question. And the second question would be, can the government actually be somebody and a space to provoke these types of conversations that fall into these gray spaces between disciplines, between universities, to start creating territories where we can come together and speak about this, so projects gather a life of their own. So I think that weaving together this narrative and creating spaces within the city and within government for ideas to be put into place will be one of the most important things that we will be doing. Just to name one example, Mexico City has 14,000 properties that are owned by the city. And this goes everything from small spaces between buildings to large buildings that are underutilized. And one of the first things that we will be doing is making contests of just like creating a catalog of these underutilized spaces and what type of ideas come from university students that could just like reimagine and rethink these city spaces. And like that, we have quite a few of just like garnering the talent and garnering the ideas that come from the university scape.
Yeah, there will be many things to say about cities in Canada at this moment and about the Harper government, but I'm not in a position to comment. So but I will talk about universities. So as I said, you know, I know it's a very, very difficult period. It's difficult because the funding model, the business model, the organization of universities has been based on this idea that, you know, universities have a monopoly on the creation, the dissemination, and the conservation of knowledge, and they have to move to something else, and it's particularly difficult. It's difficult also because because of that, you have to change the culture of those institutions. My foundation is engaged at this moment in an initiative just to create a dialogue, what we hope will be a productive dialogue between private foundations and large philanthropic foundations and universities. Universities were treating foundation traditionally basically as a place where you find money when you need money when you need seed money for a project, or when you need money to just conclude a project that has been funded elsewhere. And foundations were happy to do that. We're not interested in that model anymore. We're asking for true partnership. We're asking to be able to have a say in the way projects will be developed. And it will take time for universities to accept this new way of working. I still think, especially the larger universities have such a competitive advantage in the knowledge economy. I think it's self-evident that, you know, they could thrive. But again, it will be a very, very difficult transition. I'm very sure of that.
So I'll try and get to a few of the questions. The first, which I think was about Cornell's physical location and how do you use urban design to make sure that there's connections to the local economy. Clearly, part of the decision criteria was to do with what land was available, and the city had a number of different sites that it offered to respondents in the competition. Roosevelt Island was the one that Cornell felt best fit their needs. But we're a land-constrained city in New York, right? So that's always going to be an issue. Besides having an open campus, I'm not sure what you can do physically in terms of the infrastructure, but certainly programmatically, there are a lot of things being put in place in the project that encourage links to both SMEs and also to, even at the level of the public school system, links between children being participants in STEM programs that are linked into the Cornell campus. The way the degrees are being structured is such that the students have to spend a much larger chunk of their degree working in the industry than in a traditional master's degree. So I think you can use some of those kind of more programmatic methods to get at that problem. Singapore, look, there are a number of different models that we're seeing around the world for this, whether it's what's happening in the Middle East or what's happening in Asia. My concern, and I think this was alluded to, that ultimately the success or failure of these institutions is about the quality of the people and the interactions between the people, and therefore, while some of these efforts to grow these new campuses are certainly very well financed, I have my concerns whether over the long term you're going to see really the type of economic benefits come from them that those behind them might hope. What else? The role of universities and constraint in a time of constrained resources. Again, yes, universities are being asked to do more and resources are declining. That's a common story in so many different fields. I think it's a very interesting time in higher education generally, right? At the moment, we're seeing these, the rise of the impact of technology on the way that education is delivered and the talk of education being unbundled. That's going to present some real challenges to some institutions of higher education, but on the flip side, it may also offer some real opportunities, including revenue and funding opportunities to those organizations that can be innovative and can grasp some of that technology and do it in the right way.
I know we're coming to the close of the time of the panel, but I just had a question. So, it's great to hear the examples of San Francisco, or Edmonton, or New York, big established cities. Now, in the presentation from our colleague of McKinsey, Yana, she also mentioned that lots of cities are emerging which are smaller and mid-sized. So, if you are living in a small or mid-sized city today in the world, can you hope or can you have the ambition to create innovation metropolis in a small city, mid-sized city? Or do you need that certain scale and global reach to be able to become an innovation metropolis? A quick response on that before we close.
Yes. I think the next city age is in Waterloo and Kitchener, Ontario, community of, between the two cities, just about 300,000. 30 years ago made a decision around their intellectual property rights and around co-op. The history is out, but 5 years ago they had the largest capitalized company in Canada, RIM BlackBerry. And that was a consequence of co-locating academia and industry and bright minds and bright people getting together and being together and being very conscious around charting their future. And I think there's numerous examples, go back to Silicon Valley. It is really around people being very, very, proud and committed to the place that they choose to call home and making a decision to make that home a better place. And I think that's what ultimately drives the world around.
Do you all agree with that point of view? So all cities can have the ambition to become an innovation metropolis.
I think all cities have the capacity to innovate. Again, I think I would go back to, what is your unique competitive advantage? What are your assets? And leveraging those appropriately. And look, perhaps if you're smaller, you can be more nimble. You're better able to coalesce the different parties that need to come together in a partnership. You're willing to take more risk. You're willing to try things that perhaps would be more difficult to try in a bigger location.
Yeah, I can't think of. Let's talk about mid-sized universities that are in the same situation. I'm thinking of McMaster in Hamilton, for instance, with mid-sized university punching way above its weight in international rankings. And in part, it's because they have reorganized the university to make sure that if you come to Mac with a health research problem, you will be sure that you will be able to mobilize the best resources in the universities, independently, completely of the department, the specialty, the way they are funded, or the department to which they are attached within the university, and it has completely changed their capacity to perform in health research. So it is possible, even for this kind of institution, which are certainly smaller than NYU or University of Toronto.
Maybe on that note, let me draw the panel to a close and clearly we all agree that cities have the capacity and the need to innovate and to create that, and the cooperation across different key partners, university, the city and the private sector are very critical. We also tend to seem to agree that all cities should have that ambition. Now, we are living in a period of change. So clearly universities have to change. Being a university academic for more than 2 decades, I see that need for change even more urgent today inside my own context. I'm sure many of you see the same need for change becoming even more urgent in your own context, city government, or whichever context you operate in. The challenge for us will be to create the change, to lead the change inside our organizations. I also see, I think that's what Simon, I like the way you put it also about the focus on people. The theme of people has come up repeatedly. And I do think that, successful innovation centers today in the world do have one unique cultural competitive advantage, and that is the ability to take diverse pool of talent, talent around the world, and make them feel at home, to use your words. And the challenge really out here is, how do you get global talent to feel at home? And of course, feeling at home is a multidimensional feeling. It's not just linked to only the diversity, it's a link to the whole comfort and the entire infrastructure for education and everything else. But I think these kind of elements are going to become very important. It's also linked to the definition of how we see innovation happening in the future. We didn't have a chance to explore that in detail. But is innovation centralized in the university structures in a few departments, or is it actually much more open innovation models in which you have innovation happening at the citizen level? People talking about citizen-driven innovation. And that really also an interesting question in terms of how do we conceptualize the notion of innovation metropolis? Does it require even a focused university? Does it actually require a mechanism to involve citizens to innovate? These are open questions for us to address going forward. And I'm sure collectively we will be addressing some of those issues in panels like this and in the future. So please join me in thanking our panel members for a very thoughtful discussion on this topic.